This morning, we're going to have Kimberly Cluff, a dear friend of mine, great attorney, is going to do some best practices on tribal ordinances for us. I don't know when you'll do Q&A, but if we do Q&A, if you ask questions, because we're recording the meeting or the session, if you could go to the microphone to ask your questions, that would be great. You have a remote here.
Okay, so thank you, Karen. It's lovely to be here. I want to say thank you to Pachanga for hosting the event, and I want to thank Karen for the invitation. I'm going to tell you a little bit about myself, because I know that when I go to trainings and conferences, it's really helpful to know, like, why am I listening to this person? So give a little bit of background. And then I'm really bad with remotes. I don't watch television, and so I'll probably break it or blow something up. Or just, there we go, great. So why are we here? I just want to start there, because I think it's really helpful to just ground in what is it that you are hoping to get from this. If you look at that and go, oh, that's not why I'm here, I don't have a burning question, you are, yeah, I mean, there's other sessions. This is what we're going to cover. And I want to really frame it as this is very, very basic. And that's very intentional, because I think so many times when we're working on tribal governance, working on ordinances, policies and procedures, regulations, whatever that governance tool is, we so often get way too complicated. And complication in tribal governance is really a foe. I think oftentimes as a lawyer in my practice, it felt like I was doing a great job when I got every single detail and went down every single rabbit hole, only to find that I had created a document that was unusable for the tribal leaders who needed to use it. And so I just really want to frame this as very, very basic, and that's very intentional. Of course, if folks have more complex questions, happy to do some Q&A, happy to stay a little bit after and answer questions. Okay, so I'm going to stop there and just give you a little bit of background about myself. So as Karen mentioned, she and I were colleagues when I was in-house general counsel at the Morongo Band of Mission Indians. And I had the absolute honor of working for Morongo for about 15 years, both as outside counsel and in-house counsel. Again, a piece that really informs my practice is the two different roles of being in-house counsel and outside counsel, because even in drafting governance, there's a difference of what good governance looks like, or the perspective that you bring, depending on which hat you're wearing that day, and I'll try to touch on that a bit. I went to law school to do Indian law. I found, I am non-native, but I found that, as most lawyers, and I think they're lying if they don't admit to this, I went to law school to avoid math, because I'm really bad at math. And yet, when I was doing my undergraduate degree, I came across the idea of jurisdiction as a result of being involved in, well, I'll just say it, like, you know, a troublemaker undergraduate in San Francisco, you know, getting arrested and jumping over fences and so on, and was doing civil disobedience out in Mercury, Nevada, against underground nuclear testing, and that was on Shoshone land. And I noticed that there was a big difference between kind of where you were on trust land, didn't know it was trust land at the time, versus fee land. And this idea of jurisdiction became fascinating to me. And that's what actually led me to a practice of Indian law. I went to law school to do Indian law. I was at California Indian Legal Services for several years. I was in-house counsel briefly at Friendship House Association of American Indians in San Francisco. And then I was in private practice with George Foreman, who I consider to be one of my mentors. That's little Indian law George Foreman, not big barbecue George Foreman. And then had the honor of serving as in-house general counsel at Morongo. During the pandemic, I decided that a pandemic is a great time to get another degree. So I just finished another degree at the Goldman School of Public Policy. And that degree and that experience was wonderful. And it also informs my practice in thinking about policy, ordinances, drafting, processes. So a little bit of that knowledge also infused in how I see this process of drafting. And now I have the honor of serving as as the legal director at a nonprofit called the California Tribal Families Coalition. And I focus now on child welfare. So if anybody is familiar with the Brackeen case, which is pending at the Supreme Court, we're waiting for a decision, probably going to come down in late June. That's been about 90% of my time, and then about 90% of my other time is spent working directly with tribes, direct representation, and then about 80% of the rest of my time, yeah, bad at math, is spent working directly on policy, legislation, training, and other advocacies in the space of child welfare. So that's a little bit about me. I'm also the mom of 3 kids and still standing. So tribal laws, ordinances, regulations, and I'm going to, for our purposes, just refer to those as ordinances, but I don't want it to be lost that, for example, the tribe or the government that you work for, they may not call them ordinances. That's okay. We're talking about overall governance, but for ease of use, I'll just use the term ordinance. They can be really, really useful tools in protecting tribal lands and tribal realty operations, and that's what we're going to focus on. Again, in a very simple structure, because I think it's essential we keep it simple. There's a saying, and it's been attributed many times, but someone said, why is your book so long? I think it was Mark Twain, right? And the reason that Mark Twain wrote such long books is because he said, I'm not a good enough writer to make it shorter. A short, brief piece of tribal governance oftentimes is the sign of good drafting. Oh, see, I'm really bad with these things. Okay. So I'm gonna cover what I think are 4 key components for effective drafting. What makes them effective and useful? I wanna emphasize useful. You could have a tremendously thorough and excellent piece of tribal governance or ordinance, and it is completely not useful to the people who need to utilize it. So number 1, clarity. That seems so simple, but I'll talk a little bit more about how you get to clarity. Number 2, that it's consistent with other tribal laws, policy, federal law, and I should have probably added in there state law, even local law. Sometimes we have to draft around things that are going on locally. Number 3, contains enforcement mechanisms and remedies. Enforcement mechanisms and remedies. It does no good to attribute, for example, a responsibility somewhere and not have a way to check on whether or not that responsibility is being met. And that can be very complex. Just by a raise of hands, can people raise their hand if they're not, or how about this? Raise your hand if you're from a PL 280 state. Or you work in a PL 280 state, right. And then raise your hand if you're not in a PL 280 state. Yeah, so we're at about a 75-25 split, and that can make a tremendous difference. So I'm not going to cover the differences I'm not going to go deeply into kind of jurisdictional powers, civil regulatory, criminal prohibitory powers, and whether or not you're in a PL 280 or non-PL 280 state. But I'm going to say right now, please be aware of that. If you are legal counsel, I think you should be well aware of that. If you're not legal counsel, make sure that your legal counsel that you're working with is really running whatever, for example, the remedies through the rubric of PL 280 or non-PL 280 and enforceability. And then lastly, whatever you draft needs to be easily accessible. And I'll talk about accessibility and what that means. It used to be easily accessible when I started practicing a million years ago, was that everybody had a binder on their bookshelf with the code or the ordinance in it. That is not accessibility anymore. We are much more sophisticated in terms of accessibility. And without these 4, and there's others, my word of wisdom, without these 4, if you're missing any of these 4, all I can say is ugh. So I do want to pause for a second and talk about conflicts of laws. And I'm not going to go really deep in, but I do think it's something that you should have, again, to be mindful of. Conflicts of law often exist, and they are outside of tribal control, but we should still be aware of them. And you just see there, I put an image from an article, and this is a little bit old, but it's talking about when tribal law conflicts with federal law. Now, this article was specifically, I think it was VAWA, right, the Violence Against Women's Act. And in that, there's a multitude of pieces that intersect. So there's tribal law enforcement, there's on-reservation, off-reservation, there's tribal court, state court, there's enforceability of orders, all of those things. In the context of land tenure, in the context of tribes being able to govern on their land, those things do come up. They're not as, splashy or out there. They're a little bit more nuanced. Sometimes they're a little harder to access. They might be really in the penumbra of, or the penumbra. See, that is a word you should never use, penumbra. I was just talking to a friend and saying, I was kind of joking about that I was writing some talking points for somebody and that I was going to be sure that they weren't full of verbosity. Come on, like, give me a break. To just be aware of conflicts of laws issues. And if you don't know what that means at all, that's totally fine, but make sure that you've got someone that you're partnering with that is going to do that check for you if it's something that's relevant to what you're working on. Okay, so number 1 of the 4, clarity. What makes a tribal ordinance meet a standard of clarity? Number 1, readability. Avoids jargon and unnecessary legalese. If your ordinance includes the word verbosity or penumbra, you are missing the clarity objective. But clarity goes much deeper. So for example, unnecessary legalese. Now there are times when you must have legal terms. Okay? So the term jurisdiction, the term fee. Believe it or not, you all here, when you hear the term fee, you know exactly what that means. You're talking about fee land. But what is a brand new tribal leader, maybe let's just even say a tribal leader who didn't grow up on the reservation, isn't super familiar with tribal governance, and comes to a meeting, and you have a whole conversation about fee land versus trust land. You have not done your job if you have not taken a moment to explain that term of art. And your ordinance has not done its job if it does not provide guidance on those terms of art. Or even more, at Morongo, we there is this great program, and I got to be part of it. It was super fun, where they called it sovereignty class. And they would bring in the youth that are 15, 16, 17, getting ready to be voting members of the tribe. And they have to learn about their tribal government and tribal governance and what all the different departments in the tribe do and where do they go when they have questions. And it's like 2.5, 3 days, and they kind of go around. And in the last couple of years when I was at Morongo, we made it almost like a scavenger hunt. They had to go to each department and ask a question, and it was super. I know, you'd have to ask the 16-year-olds if it was super fun. I thought it was super fun. If they have to read the ordinance, the P&Ps, the tribal law that you've just written or been part of writing, are they going to understand it? Are they going to understand if you don't explain what fee means or even what trust means? I can tell you over my career how many times I've had, and it generally feels like it's younger folks. I'm reading a police report, and here's what I see. And the young man yelled, "This is a PL 280 state, you can't arrest me." Right? Showing a fundamental lack of understanding about, for example, jurisdiction and authority. And oftentimes what's important is that there's a resource that folks can go to, whether that's tribal leaders, tribal employees, but also tribal members, so they can understand the governance within the tribe. And they can understand the intersection between tribal governance and local governance, state governance, and where they fit in between. If you have a family who has lost a family member and they're trying to figure out kind of what's happening with that estate, not only may they not understand the ordinance that's in place that's supposed to help guide them in the process of understanding the title of their land, they're also potentially in grief, and maybe there's conflict, and so you hope that your ordinance is clear. And if it's not, let's say you've submitted to the Bureau and it's got to have required elements and so on, then you have something that goes with it that's a guide that's really clear and really breaks it down. So readability, avoids jargon and unnecessary legalese, brevity. Now this is a double-edged sword. Brevity means keep it brief, right? Avoid there you go, verbose. What is me? Anyways, me and that word. Avoid complex language. However, don't give yourself a false sense of, if this goes over 50 pages, it's too long. You've got to cover the topic completely. So not brevity just for I was about to say pagination's sake, but right, not brevity just for the sake of having not that many pages, but brevity overall in the content. Now, if you find yourself with an ordinance or a piece of governance that is 50, 60, 100 pages long, give it a really good read and see if it can be broken up into parts. I will only speak for myself, but you give me a 100-page document, and I'm thinking this is better than Ambien. I'm not going to be able to read it thoroughly all the way through and feel like I have a handle on it. But broken into parts, much, much better. And then organized. So key. If you do have a document that, especially if it tends to go on the long side, make sure that's organized. So what would be one really great tool to have a document be organized? How many of you have been in a meeting where somebody says the following? Turn to the page behind the other page, that one that has the bullet points on it. Yeah, go to the 7th bullet point down, kind of towards the bottom. That conversation should never happen. Nobody should ever say, go to the 7th bullet point. What they should say is go to page 10, subsection 4, and okay, maybe it's okay to say Romanette 3. Does anybody know what Romanette is? Right? That's super obnoxious. I think we should ban Roman numerals in tribal documents. Just my personal feeling. So organized in a way where it is paginated at the top and at the bottom, has a footer at the top and a footer at the bottom, something at the top, where the sections are clearly outlined. Maybe your titles are bolded. Don't have hanging threads of language on the last page because people will miss it. Have the date clear, maybe even on every single page. How many of you have been in a meeting where someone in the meeting is looking at the old version? Just like, right? That's the old version. Here's the new version. Well, the date's not on it. I know these seem simple, but all taken together, they really do both improve people's ability to understand the document and also your ability to communicate effectively in a short period of time what needs to happen. The other piece of being organized is how about a definition section? I mentioned before about terminology. How about a section up front that has all the definitions of terms of art that are in the document? So you explain what fee is in the definitions. Here's one of the beauties of having a definition section at the beginning of your ordinance. You then take that definition section and use it on the next ordinance. So you have clear and consistent definitions across tribal governance. Super helpful. Because I spent tons of time trying to reconcile a term in one ordinance that was defined differently in another ordinance and decide which one was going to be the controlling definition. So a definition section, I think, is super key. And be liberal with your definition section, even if it's not a term of art, but it's just something that people might not understand. And one other is acronyms. I think that acronyms can be very helpful shortcuts when we're speaking, right? And I'll give an example. NAGPRA. Now, by the way, there is a difference, and I don't actually know what it is, between when you actually say it as a word, like NAGPRA, versus you say the initials, like the difference between IGRA, like I'm saying it phonetically, and IGRA. Nobody ever says IGRA, right? Anyways, let's just call those acronyms. Explain the acronym, delineate it out, don't assume that people know. I call it talking in code. Lawyers are really good at talking in code. I think we somehow have the belief we can charge more per hour the more we talk in code and people don't understand us. Spell out those terms. So if you're utilizing the term, you're using NAGPRA, at least put it in the definitional section or explain it all the way out the first time it appears in your document. Just use spell check, find where it first appears, and spell it all the way out. So that's on clarity. It's a worthy goal to try and be short. It's a worthy goal to try and have your document be as brief and clear as possible, but don't do so at the peril of not covering what needs to be covered appropriately. Okay, Number 3, consistent with other tribal laws and policies and Fed law. So, really important to understand the underlying documents that the ordinance you're working on may rely on. So for example, if the tribe has a constitution, is what you're drafting consistent with the Constitution? I've lately become a fan of actually looking at, for example, the preamble language in the Constitution and maybe repeating some of that at the beginning of an ordinance to be sure that you're providing the right kind of base knowledge and reference in each and every ordinance. So you want them, your tribal law, your tribal governance, to have that common underlying governance premise. So for example, does authority for that ordinance come from the Constitution? Does it come from the tribal council? Or maybe the authority to have that ordinance comes from a vote of the general membership. Tribes are different. Make sure that you articulate that so that when there's perhaps a controversy or you're submitting this ordinance to some entity and they say, well, was this ordinance passed with due authority? You can say, read the first sentence, ding dong. It's right there. I would never say ding dong. Well, I might. I'm not sure. Don't forget policies and procedures that already exist. Make sure that as you're drafting, you're mindful of other equal pieces of ordinance, but also don't forget P&Ps, right? Just how things are done. You don't want something you're drafting to run headlong into a practice that's been in place in a department or within a tribe, within tribal governance, that's how they do it. Because what you will get is some mutiny from the folks who have to do the job, and they say, wait, this ordinance, I mean, it's articulating, say, a responsibility that it's not how we do it. It's not how, let's say, it's not how our software works. It's not how we keep that record. So the ordinance says we have to keep X record for X period of time, but that's not how we do it. We keep X record in a different way for a different period of time for good reason, because we're knowledgeable, we're the people who actually do the work. So make sure that you're also talking to the people who actually hold the responsibility or the job to do the thing you're articulating in that tribal ordinance. Consistent with, where appropriate, unwritten customs and traditions. So for example, the ordinance requires X action in X month when the tribal government maybe has a dark period. I have seen where an ordinance requires an action to take place within, let's say, 72 hours and makes no exception. And I can imagine the tribal members or the tribal leaders at the time saying, we are going to be more disciplined, we have to turn these things around, we're going to hold ourselves to very hard timelines. But they didn't think what happens if an elder passes and the government goes dark and they're not taking action. So be mindful of custom and tradition that may run into a desire to do a certain thing, and I'm specifically talking about on a certain date, but also in a certain place. And we often put things that, the locus of power of the tribe is on reservation. But more and more, for example, actions are taking place off reservation. Make sure that you don't include something that would require action to take place on reservation. Or create an exception if necessary. Number 3 here, include common provision like the tribe's of the tribe's governance, like how to amend this ordinance, or choice of laws, or waivers of sovereign immunity. Oh my goodness, waivers of sovereign immunity. Make sure you have consistency, right? We do, we don't. We do in these certain circumstances. It's really tough when the rules change depending, every single time. On contracts related to land, we do X. On contracts related to transactions, we do Y. It's okay if they're different, just make sure it's clear. Because you may have a tribal leader, for example, or a colleague who remembers how we do it over in transactions and forgets that that's not how we do it over in something else. Okay? Refer to or be consistent with and take advantage of federal statute, right? Just remember that intersection between tribal law and federal statute as opposed to what's going on locally or at the state level. And then I want you to just think about other things present for the government that you work for. Other ways in which you would make sure that what you're drafting would be consistent with other tribal laws and policies or federal law. So what would you do to make sure you have that consistency? Those of you who work for jurisdictions that have searchable ordinances, like online searchable ordinances, rock on, right? Run a couple of searches. Look for terminology. If you don't, I don't know, hire an intern to start reading. But just make sure that your ordinance from 1972 doesn't get forgotten, and make sure you go back and take a look at it. That brings up another thing, which is I think it's really important to imagine or think about, even if it's not written, when you have a conflict between ordinances, which one is going to prevail. Oftentimes, the standard that the lawyers will think is the one that was passed first, or the one that was passed second, depending on certain circumstances. If you don't have clarity in that and you have a conflict, so maybe you include language that says, as is currently articulated in tribal law until changed by this ordinance through amendment or future laws passed in accordance with the tribal constitution. Your ordinances and your governance aren't static, so drafting towards the idea that everything could change is just so important. I think that's actually one of the areas that is most complex in this. Okay, so I wanted to put up here, this is from Nils from the NARF library, and it's from Squaxin Island Constitution. Anybody here from Squaxin? No? Great, okay. And this is language from the beginning of a piece of their Constitution. It's not the actual beginning of the Constitution. And it describes territory. And so what it does is it lays out what is the territory of the tribe, and it actually lays out really nicely a kind of authority. And I thought this was a good section in that it's pretty broad, and it lays out a nice articulation in relatively plain English. What is the body of land and the intersection of that body of land with authority for this particular tribe? I also put this up here because I wanted to point out this is a great resource. If you go to the NARF library, many tribes have their ordinances published on, publicly, and then NARF, through the library, assembles them. I am not a believer in reinventing the wheel. I think we can learn a tremendous amount by building on our brilliant colleagues that have done work before us. Does not mean that you can just do a find and replace with the name of the tribe on some other tribe's ordinances, and I've definitely seen that. But I think understanding, reading other tribes' work, and then building on it, making that work, learning from maybe what their light bulbs that they had in their drafting, I think can be really great. So number one, I thought this was a nice articulation of territory, and also wanted to remind everybody about those resources that are out there. Hey Karen, can we do a time check? I have no idea. I've been talking for like 4 minutes, right?
11 o'clock.
It's 11? Rock on, okay. Okay. I'm gonna just pause there for a second and ask if there's any question. Then if you did have a question, if you could step to the mic, that'd be great. Okay, no questions. That's like a super awkward pause. I think it's something they don't teach us in law school, to like stop talking and just be quiet for a minute. So uncomfortable. Okay. This is from the ILCA amendments from 2000. I'm pretty sure I pulled the 2000. Gosh. So requires approval by the Secretary within 180 days of any adopted Indian trial probate code governing descent and distributions of trust or restricted interests. This is a policy guidance that's on the Bureau's website. And I wanted to point this out because it's giving folks like us some guidance on drafting, right, and what's required. I don't find it particularly accessible. I mean, it doesn't read really easily. Sorry, anybody here from the Bureau or anything who did this writing. But your ordinance requires approval by the Secretary within 180 days of any adopted Indian trial probate code governing descent and distribution of trust or restricted interests. The ordinance needs to outline approval procedures, reserves life estates for non-Indian devisees who would otherwise be precluded from inheriting by reason of the adopted code, and authorizes payments by tribes to such devisees to acquire interests. Okay. So you have a family who comes into the office and they have just had a relative pass and they're trying to dig through the ordinance and they're confused and you're like, well, this is why we wrote the ordinance this way, and you want to have them understand that you did it right, that the ordinance is good, and you might show them this guidance and say, see, we did it according to the guidance that the federal government gives us, and you did it just consistent with this. And they're going to say, what's a devisee? Right? So you need to be prepared either to point to where you defined that in the ordinance, or you're going to need to be prepared to explain it. And I would think in this circumstance, wow, wouldn't it be great if you had a really wonderful visual roadmap that you could hand them, that walked them through, not, you don't need to give them a handout that's designed for you that you got at a conference that walks you through Indian probate reform, for example, or land consolidation issues, but something that's actually designed for a user like a tribal member or a tribal leader that takes them through a little bit of that kind of jargon, or takes them through their piece of the universe of land tenure and probate and land and ownership, in a way that is through the lens that a consumer of that information needs, that's a tribal member or a tribal leader. So pointing them to this and saying, hey, we did it right, we met all these yardsticks or our milestones, not going to be super helpful. But what is helpful is for practitioners like yourself to go and look at this and say, oh, did we hit these, right? Did we, for example, outline approval procedures? Did we put that in there? Okay. And then number 4 of kind of the top 4 key components of good drafting, not to say, there could probably be 12, 15, maybe 30 components of good drafting, just trying to hit the high points. But number 4, that the ordinance contains enforcement mechanisms and or kind of remedies. Enforcement mechanisms or remedies. So number 1, does the ordinance articulate how the responsibilities that are in there, or the obligations that are in there, how they'll be enforced? What does enforcement look like? Now, look, I've drafted lots of ordinances that don't really don't need an enforcement mechanism, right? There certainly are ordinances that exist within tribal governance that don't need an enforcement mechanism, but I think many do. Now, I'm going to use a non-land related one that's pretty straightforward. A common, one of my favorite is dog ordinances, right? But that's a real issue in some places. If you have dogs that are running around, people don't feel safe. If you have dogs that are running, especially your elders might not feel safe. It really can interfere with folks' sense of safety and quality of life. Okay, so you have a dog ordinance, and it says something like, people shouldn't have dogs running around, making our elders feel unsafe, creating, unsanitary conditions because they go into the garbage cans. Okay, that's great. That's a nice aspiration. Who is responsible? Okay, so then the tribe says, well, the tribe will contract for those services. So they use local animal control. What if the contract lapses and there is no local animal control? What if local animal control just stops existing because the county decides to shift it over to the city and you don't have a contract with the city? You want your ordinance to also imagine enforceability or responsibility outside of some specific contract that exists in 2023 that may not be renewed. I know that's a little bit of a weird example, but it's actually on a day-to-day basis one that I dealt with quite frequently. Off-road vehicles, quads, big one, and dogs. Yep. Okay. How will the rights that are contained therein, how will they be protected? So just going back to the idea of the dog ordinance, to keep it simple, I'm an elder. I feel unsafe because my neighbor is raising dogs, and they are noisy, and they get out, and they scare me, and I don't feel safe, and my grandkids can't come over anymore because everybody's fearful that the grandkids will get bitten by the dogs. So does that tribal member actually have any kind of right to enforce the protections that run to them, or do they have to go to tribal police, or do they have to go to animal control off reservation, or do they go to tribal council? What's their remedy to be protected? And that goes in, that actually potentially has an intersection with land. Who's responsible to protect on that particular allotment? Or maybe it's not an allotment. Maybe it's some other type of land title. And who is protected and who is responsible based on the articulation of responsibilities given the land title that's there. Now, what I just walked through runs headlong and maybe conflicts with another tenet of good ordinance drafting, which is brevity. You can't go down every rabbit hole. You can't solve every possible hypothetical in your ordinance. What you're drafting for, what your goal, your aspiration is that if a whole host of different scenarios pop up, that people can look to that ordinance and they can find at least a roadmap to solution. So you're not trying to anticipate every hypothetical, but you're also not leaving people with no guidance in where they go when they're trying to enforce the roles, the responsibilities, and the rights of the ordinance that you're working on. And then, are there outside entities that need to be part of enforcement? And for example, this is not really an outside entity, but if your ordinance is going to have any intersection with your tribal court, maybe you should talk to your tribal court. Maybe they should be part of the drafting team. If you're looking to the tribal court to protect some of those rights that people receive through the ordinance. But also, and again, going back to the dog example, what about local law enforcement? What about animal control? Making sure that you're not setting up a responsibility that animal control or the entity that you're expecting to provide the remedy under the ordinance, that they're not willing to do. There's a common issue that I've seen is with utilities and land, right? So there's a problem with a utility provider. Let's say overhead lines, telephone poles in the wrong place, power poles in the wrong place, not articulated on the map of that allotment or that assignment. Who's responsible for moving, when grandpa wants to put an addition on the side of the house and there's a pole and it's not supposed to be there? Who's responsible? Is the tribe responsible for approaching the utility? Is grandpa responsible for approaching the utility? It'd be really nice if you had a roadmap so that when that super angry grandpa comes into the office, you can say, I didn't make this rule. It's articulated here. Here's your remedy. Here's what you do. So a common area that tribes need to govern is in land, especially with regard to land, is in trespass. Has anybody in the room ever had to deal with a trespass issue? Yeah, a couple. Yeah, and trespass can be really tricky, and it depends on where you are. It depends on what state you're in, what county you're in. It depends on honestly, it depends a lot on the relationship that you have if you're relying on outside law enforcement, or even if you have tribal law enforcement, who has to intersect with outside law enforcement. This is often a really touchy issue. And what you see there is an information bulletin that came out of the California Attorney General's office. The Attorney General in California now is Rob Bonta. Before that, it was Javier Becerra. Before that, it was now Vice President Harris. And there has been at times kind of a touchy relationship around enforcement and law enforcement on reservation here in California and in other places. But I was happy to see when this information bulletin came out addressing issues of trespass, because trespass can be super problematic. And I'll say, for example, one issue that's been a real hot button, and in fact in this information bulletin is even referenced, is around cannabis and cartels or other folks who do bad stuff related to drug manufacturing or drug or cannabis cultivation. And so it's really important to have some governance around this, and that oftentimes will intersect with trespass. It also might intersect with water usage. It might intersect with energy usage. You know, you've got somebody has a grow house, and they're using a tremendous amount of energy, and they're using a tremendous amount of water. And I know that more and more tribes are either embracing cannabis industry, rejecting the cannabis industry, trying to figure out how they're going to navigate the cultivation or the processing of cannabis on reservation. And your ordinances can provide a great roadmap, number one, for your members who might want to enter that business. Number two, for your leaders who are feeling a little bit torn about it. I mean, you know, if you look at the federal level, there's not great clarity with the Cole memo, et cetera, et cetera. So I think that the clarity of the Bonta information bulletin is helpful, and I don't know if other jurisdictions in other states and other state AGs have issued or kind of entered this space. If you're in a place where the issue of trespass is difficult and you're not in California, maybe look to something like this and say, hey, how about our AG does something like this that's suitable for our jurisdiction? Okay, easily accessible. Easily accessible. So I mentioned that easily accessible used to mean that you had it in a binder on your bookshelf, and that was like great. You know, you could just go over, take the binder down, go through the pages, you highlighted the stuff that was really important, and that was accessibility. That is not accessibility anymore. You've got to be sure that your ordinances are accessible, but in different forms of accessibility. So for example, one that has become a hot button is accessibility for people with disabilities. Is your tribal ordinance available for people who are sight impaired? Guarantee you that there are members of tribes that have vision issues. How do you make your ordinances accessible to them? You have members who don't have Wi-Fi. You have tribal members or tribal leaders that live far away and aren't going to walk into and grab that binder that you have so nice and available on your bookshelf in your office. During COVID, right? People weren't meeting in person. How were they accessing the tribal laws that they needed to cogitate on, that they needed to work with? How were they accessing their tribal laws when they weren't able to come together and be handed a nice packet that staff in the realty office put together for them? I think also in thinking about accessibility, it's really important to consider custom and tradition around what is public and what is not public. So a very key way in which we make tribal law and tribal ordinances accessible now is we put them online. But many tribes don't want everything online. A common ordinance that tribes don't want online is, for example, membership. Or maybe ordinances related to per cap, or ordinance that might even be, for example, related to litigation. And so how do you make your laws accessible and at the same time be honoring custom, tradition, feelings around things being public? Now the reverse is true. One key component of due process in this country, under the United States Constitution, is that people have to know what laws apply to them, especially if they are going to suffer a consequence of that law. You can't say to somebody, oh, you just violated the law and we're going to require that you spend a night in jail, or we're going to require you pay a fee, and the person says, what law? I can't show you. You don't get to see it. That is not, we do not accept that as due process, and tribes really do a disfavor to themselves when they don't have those laws, ordinances, or policies public that people have to intersect with, especially when they're going to be held accountable. And I'll give an example. Tort claims. So a tort claim ordinance for people who trip and fall at tribal businesses. So I trip and I fall at a tribal business. I now want to go to the tribe and be made whole because I broke my kneecap. And the tribe says we have a process for that because we're required to have a process for that. We're required under our gaming compact to have a process for me, a patron who trips and falls and breaks her kneecap. Oh, great, I want to use that process. I want to use that to be made whole, to pay my medical bills. Sorry, we don't make that public. Wait, what? Or you have to come to us and we'll hand you a copy. Wait, what? I live 100 miles away and I have a broken kneecap. Well, that's the rule. That really makes the tribe look like they're hiding the ball and not engaging in good faith attempts or work to make the remedy for that patron accessible to them. But in fact, it does happen. It happens that tribes don't have their ordinances available to folks who need them in order to be made whole for wrongs that happen on reservation or allegations of wrongs that happen on reservation. So strongly recommend, as you're drafting, to be thinking about how is this going to be accessible to the people that need it. Anywhere from that 15-year-old kiddo who's trying to figure out what it means to be a tribal member and might vote in the next election when they turn 18, to the patron who broke their kneecap, to the brand new tribal council leader, to the lawyer or the director of the department who's going to take over after you because you won the lottery and moved to Haiti or somewhere fun. I don't know, where'd you move to? Karen, where would you move to if you won the lottery? Somewhere fun. Great, Florida. That is not fun. I was thinking like Bora Bora or something, like some warm, what was that? Fiji, okay. So you won the lottery, you're moving to Fiji, somebody needs to step in and they see the binder on your shelf and they see the portal that's password protected on the tribe's website and they have to suddenly get up to speed and do all the things that you do because you're living the life in Fiji with your lottery winnings. Are they going to be able to do it? Is there a roadmap either embedded in the ordinance that they have to enforce or work with? Or are there tools outside of the actual ordinance, like an FAQ, a frequently asked questions? Or a nice roadmap that says, hey, I hear you got my job because I moved to Fiji. Here's an outline of how it is that you're going to read this ordinance. This is what the tribal council or the general membership, when they passed it, this is the problem they were trying to solve. That history, the background, can be really, really helpful, and I think is just key to enforceability, to visibility of tribal ordinances, and of course to that accessibility. Ordinances must consistently be cross-referenced against new and amended ordinances. They can't be static. So you are so stoked, you finished writing that probate ordinance for the tribe and everyone's super happy, isn't that great? And you just you download it, it's on the tribe's portal, everyone can access it, and then, oh, the feds just tweaked something, changed it. Got to go in there, you got to know exactly how is it that we amend this ordinance? What do we have to do? And in your ordinance, you have really clear language that says this is how you amend the ordinance. You can have 2 or 3 ways of amending it. Amendments that are required only to comply with federal statute don't have to go back to, the long, vote by the entire general membership or something, right? That if it's just to comply with changes, minor changes in federal statute, they can be done through tribal council. Just whatever the methodology of amending and keeping it relevant, make sure it's really articulated in there. Your ordinances can't be static. Now, the other piece of accessibility, and you can see up there, hopefully, I know the type is probably really small, that is from the Yurok tribe in far northern California. That's the preamble to the Yurok Constitution. And the reason I put that up there is because they use a service that many tribes are using, and I'm now going to forget the name of the company. The word code is in it. Anybody have their codes codified online using a third-party vendor? Anybody have that? It's so awesome. Searchable, all in order. You can amend. It's not inexpensive, but so incredibly worth it. And I think it's just called codeservice.com. And we worked with them at Morongo to come in and codify and put everything similar to if you pick up, say 25 USC, and you see a table of contents of all the sections and then cross-references internally. They do that for you. They put it up online. You can password protect the ordinances you want to password protect. You can make public the areas that you want to have be public. So tremendously useful third-party vendor. And I'm sure that there's others that do that. But that's what the Yurok tribe did. And so you can see that portal that you see right there going into their tribal law and governance is through that third-party vendor. And when we worked with them, I found them to be incredibly professional and really good. So trust me, I'm not getting commission. I can't even remember the name of the company. But if you have a large body of tribal laws, you want them to be searchable. So think searchable, like how cool that you can essentially Google tribal law. That's kind of awesome, right? And that's where I think we all need to be in short order, is the ability to be searchable in your body of tribal laws, ordinances, policies, and regulations. And that searchability and having everything public, I think, really legitimizes your tribal law and your tribal ordinances so that outsiders can look and see. The expectation with state law, even county law, federal law, is that it can be searched. And so it really legitimizes and brings up the perception that tribal law is legitimate. And I'm not saying that searchability makes legitimacy, not in the least, but sometimes you really need to hit on perception, even in people that are involved in other jurisdictional governments. You know, if you can say to a state partner, if they've got a question, you can say, oh, you can search it on the tribe's website. Just go into our governance tab on our tribe's website. You can search that. That's kind of awesome. And I think creates a level of legitimacy in perception. Okay. Lastly, and I'm getting close to the end, Karen, so time check-wise, I think we're good. Nobody's ever complained when I finish early. That's just like not a thing. So look for other tools. Look for others who have experience in what you're looking at. Look for developments in the area and look for people who have done the work. And I mentioned this already, but here's one specifically. Look at NARF's website and tribes that post their ordinances there. But be aware of very significant underlying legal differences like Public Law 280, for example. Or that something is geared towards a tribe that has a constitution. Morongo does not have a constitution, for example. Many tribes in California don't. Or it's an IRA constitution that has had to be amended or hasn't been amended. And oftentimes those old IRA constitutions don't reflect what the tribe is currently doing. And so be aware of those differences. But there are tremendous resources out there. And then there's super smart people who do work on this. This is from, I think it's a law firm that focuses on tribal workplace stuff. So here they have 7 tips to protect tribal businesses and sovereignty when you're drafting tribal law. And you can learn from this. And this article was super accessible. You didn't have to be a lawyer to read it. It had some very basic ideas. But if I'm working on a project, oftentimes, and this kind of circles all the way back to the beginning, we have a tendency as the experts in our field to go deep, to go complex, to think of all of the things in every rabbit hole. And that is the enemy of accessibility and brevity and clarity. But then there's the balance, that it has to be correct, it has to be thorough, it has to cross-reference, it has to take into consideration those other governing documents, and that gets complex. And so the real magic of excellent ordinance drafting is that balance between those 4 tenets of brevity and accessibility, clarity, and that thoroughness, the complexity that you're able to see, dissect, and make simple. That's really where the magic happens. It's so dorky to be like, that's where the magic happens in ordinance drafting. It's like, wow, what a nerd. But it's true. That is where it happens. And then the other is to be sure that you're aware of not just developments or ideas that are happening on that legal level with, say, state statute or federal statute or what's happening locally. But then remember the litigation element. Because one decision out of a court that's relevant to the tribe may change things. Anybody familiar with the McGirt decision? Right? Supreme Court case that changed the jurisdictional landscape for so much of Oklahoma and has thrown so much into kind of chaos, I think, in my humble opinion, great chaos, but still chaotic. You've got to be aware, I am certain that there are a number of ordinances for the tribes affected by the McGirt case that are no longer relevant or don't work because of that change in that Supreme Court case. We have the Brackeen decision that's going to come down. Now, I'm an optimist. I think that the Supreme Court is going to do right by the Indian Child Welfare Act, but if it doesn't, let's say that there are changes in, let's just say, for example, one of the areas that the court was extremely focused on was the definition of an Indian child. If the definition of an Indian child changes and that tribe has an ordinance that defines Indian child by cross-referencing a federal statute, well then now that tribal ordinance and its definition of who's affected may now be really problematic because it cross-referenced 25 U.S.C. 1901 and its definitions. So you have to be aware of developments in the courtroom. And this article was specifically about tribal court litigation. And what you find in the tribal court litigation area, one, it's not easy to get those decisions. So you have to dig a little bit, although it's getting easier. And number two, I think primarily what you find is the questions that get answered are things like who has authority? What do they have authority over? What do the tribal courts have authority over? When you have people who are trying to get remedies out of a state court and a tribal court, like say the plaintiffs are in tribal court and the defendants are in state court and they're competing about who gets to make a decision. It's important to see that because remember, one of the tenets of good ordinance drafting is making sure you articulate the remedies portion. And if you've got confusion about responsibilities and remedies, and there's a question about jurisdiction or power of tribal courts versus state or local courts, you're going to have a problem. The one thing that you really never want is for your ordinance to be the cause or the locus of litigation. Right? Nobody wants to be like, oh yeah, I drafted that ordinance that now the tribe is spending, $1 million litigating in a circuit court. No one wants to be that person. Now that doesn't mean that you can anticipate or envision or have a crystal ball to see all the things that may happen, and you can't draft to solve every future problem, because in that case you're going to be drafting many hundreds of pages and no one's going to be able to understand it. It's not going to be a useful piece of ordinance. So again, the magic is in the balance between brevity and clarity and accessibility, and on the other hand, going deep enough into the topic, articulating enough the remedies, the responsibilities, anticipating what's happening out in the world, being cognizant of litigation, being cognizant of litigation or questions in tribal court if that's relevant, and trying to bring those together in a piece of ordinance that people can read, understand, find helpful in terms of guidance, that can be dynamic and responsive, isn't static, people can get to. And if you can draft towards that audience of that 15 or 16 or 17-year-old who's about to vote, get ready to vote and be a fully participating tribal citizen, or that brand new tribal leader who isn't always talking about these issues and all the acronyms, then that's where you get to that sweet spot of really excellent tribal governance. And you've empowered your elected tribal leaders to do a great job in their leadership because they can understand what's required. They can lead towards that good outcome that your tribal governance is hoping to get to, improving the quality of life for tribal citizens, protecting tribal sovereignty, protecting tribal nationhood. Okay. So that's the end of slides. And I'm super happy to answer questions. I'm also happy to not answer questions. I'm happy to answer questions at the mic. I'm also happy to sit down here on this stage and people can come up and ask me questions. I really appreciate your time and attention. I hope if the only thing you take away from this is 1 or 2 points that kind of resonate, and you're like, I remember that short lady who wasn't behind the podium talked about brevity and not to use the word verbosity. Well, then hopefully at least you've got that. All right, thank you everybody, appreciate your time.